A couple, teetering on the precipice of divorce, decided on one last adventure into the unforgiving beauty of the Arizona desert, a desperate gamble to reignite a dying flame before their unborn child entered a fractured world. Then, 3 years later, a lone jogger, seeking solace in the vast emptiness of the canyonlands, stumbled upon a discovery so profoundly disturbing it ripped open a cold case and exposed a truth far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. What really happened to Liam and Chloe in the desolate embrace of the Canyon of Lost Souls? Stick around until the very end to unravel the shocking truth. And while you're here, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. The air in their rented SUV was thick with a silence heavier than any words left unspoken. Liam gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the desert highway stretching endlessly before them, a mirror to their own fractured path. Beside him, Chloe stared out the window, her silhouette outlined against the vast, empty landscape. Her hand, resting lightly on the gentle swell of her stomach, was a constant, poignant reminder of the life growing within her, a life that ironically seemed to amplify the chasm between them, rather than bridge it. This trip, this ill-conceived journey into the remote Canyon of Lost Souls, was supposed to be a reprieve, a final desperate attempt to reclaim what they had lost, or perhaps to finally admit it was gone forever. It was a pilgrimage born not of shared joy, but of a quiet, aching despair. For weeks, the suggestion had hung between them, a fragile, unspoken plea. Liam, ever the pragmatic one, had proposed it as an escape from the suffocating weight of their shared apartment, a place now haunted by bitter arguments and silent resentments. Chloe, weary and physically drained by the demands of early pregnancy, had initially resisted, but the yearning for a simpler time, for the easy laughter they once shared on sun-drenched trails, had ultimately swayed her. Now, as the iconic red rock formations began to rise majestically in the distance, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty earth, a flicker of that old hope, stubbornly persistent, tried to assert itself. Yet, beneath the veneer of shared purpose, the current of unspoken anxieties ran deep. Chloe felt Liam's forced cheerfulness like a dull ache, a performance for the sake of the unborn child, and perhaps for his own fading conscience. Liam, in turn, sensed Chloe's withdrawal, the subtle barrier she had erected around herself, a defense against further hurt. This canyon, with its ancient silent witnesses, would either mend them or finally, irrevocably, break them. The morning sun, still low in the sky, painted the canyon walls in hues of fiery red and deep ochre as Liam and Chloe began their ascent. It was deceptively cool at first, a deceptive peace that belied the relentless heat that would soon descend upon the desert. Liam, trying to project an air of effortless optimism, pointed out various geological formations, offering trivia he'd hastily memorized from a guidebook. Chloe offered only monosyllabic responses, her gaze fixed on the uneven path ahead, her breath already coming a little heavier than usual. Her pregnancy, now entering its second trimester, subtly altered her gait, made each step a conscious effort. Liam noticed her slowing pace, the slight flush on her cheeks even in the early hours, and a flicker of irritation, quickly suppressed, crossed his features. This was supposed to be easy, a return to their adventurous past, but every physical demand on Chloe seemed to highlight the gulf that had grown between them. They had picked a less-traveled route, seeking solitude away from the more popular trails, a decision that felt symbolic of their desire to work through their issues in private, far from prying eyes. The silence that fell between them as they hiked was not the comfortable quiet of shared understanding, but a heavy, echoing void filled with unspoken accusations and unresolved pain. They navigated narrow ledges, their boots crunching on loose gravel, the only sounds the wind whistling through ancient rock formations and the rapid beat of their own hearts. At one point, Liam reached out to help Chloe over a particularly tricky spot, and for a fleeting moment, their hands touched, a brief spark of an old connection, quickly extinguished as she pulled away. It was a dance of hesitant gestures and guarded reactions, each movement revealing more about their emotional distance than any shouted words. Midway through their planned route, they paused at a scenic overlook, a vast panorama of undulating red earth stretching to the horizon. Liam pulled out his phone, attempting to capture the moment, urging Chloe to smile for a picture. She managed a strained approximation, her eyes, however, betraying the weariness that gnawed at her. He uploaded it quickly to a shared cloud album, a timestamp of their presence, an almost subconscious act of documenting their last shared experience. Chloe, in turn, pulled out her own phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. She sent a brief, almost cryptic text to her sister, a simple check-in that contained a hint of underlying anxiety. Deep in the canyon, signals weak, might be out of touch for a bit. Don't worry if you don't hear back right away. Love you. It was an attempt to reassure, yet embedded within it was an unconscious premonition, a subtle plea for vigilance. As the sun climbed higher, so too did the temperature, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The canyon, once inviting, began to feel oppressive, its towering walls closing in, amplifying the tension between them. Hours passed without further contact from them. Back home, Chloe's sister, a naturally anxious person, felt a prickle of unease as the evening wore on without a reply. Liam's friend, who had been expecting a call about their return, found himself checking his phone with increasing frequency. The small, niggling worries began to coalesce into something more substantial, a cold dread creeping into the hearts of those who loved them. The vastness of the desert, once a symbol of freedom, now seemed to mock their concerns, a silent, impassive force, capable of swallowing secrets whole. By nightfall, as darkness consumed the canyon and their phones remained stubbornly silent, the first desperate calls were made, the first seeds of panic sown. The couple had simply vanished, leaving behind only an unsettling void and a photograph of two strained smiles against an indifferent backdrop. The night descended with an unsettling stillness over the desert, but for Chloe's sister, Sarah, and Liam's best friend, David, it became a frantic blur of unanswered calls and escalating dread. Sarah's initial unease had curdled into a cold, hard panic when dawn broke without any word from Chloe. Her sister's cryptic text, meant to alleviate worry, now felt like a premonition. David, meanwhile, had driven to the trailhead parking lot just before sunrise, a knot tightening in his stomach. He saw Liam's SUV, alone and undisturbed, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a distant street lamp. Its presence was a stark, terrifying confirmation they hadn't returned. The calls to 911 that morning were tinged with a desperate urgency, the word pregnant echoing in the dispatcher's ear like a siren. Time, in cases of wilderness disappearances, was always critical, but with a pregnant woman involved, every passing minute felt like an hour, every hour an eternity. Law enforcement agencies were quickly mobilized, their initial response swift and decisive. Within hours, the vast expanse of the Canyon of Lost Souls became the focal point of a massive search operation. Helicopters, their rotors beating a rhythmic, anxious thrum against the morning quiet, crisscrossed the sky, their powerful lenses scanning the rugged terrain below. On the ground, dozens of trained search and rescue personnel fanned out, their brightly colored vests stark against the muted reds and browns of the canyon floor. K9 units, their keen noses to the dusty earth, followed faint human scents, weaving through brush and over rocky outcrops. The first few days were a crucible of raw emotion. Families of both Liam and Chloe arrived, their faces etched with a grief that hadn't yet fully materialized. They clung to every update, every fragment of information, no matter how insignificant. News crews descended, their cameras capturing the poignant images of desperate loved ones, holding on to flimsy hopes, praying for a miracle. The story of the missing pregnant hiker and her husband captured the nation's attention, a heart-wrenching human drama unfolding against the indifferent backdrop of the wilderness. But as the relentless desert sun continued its daily cycle of ascent and descent, hope, a fragile thing to begin with, began to wither under its harsh glare. Each failed lead, each empty crevice searched, chipped away at the thin veneer of optimism. The ruggedness of the terrain, its vastness and unforgiving nature, became a character in itself, a silent antagonist in this unfolding tragedy. The search parties combed every plausible trail, every potential shelter, every water source. They found remnants, a discarded granola bar wrapper near a dry creek bed, a footprint that matched Liam's boot size near a steep incline, but nothing concrete, no personal items, no definitive signs of struggle or accident. The clues were tantalizingly scarce, frustratingly ambiguous. The discovery of their abandoned car in the trailhead parking lot, though initially providing a starting point for investigators, quickly became another layer of unsettling mystery. It sat there, perfectly intact, a silent monument to their departure, offering no hint as to why they hadn't returned to it. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just an emptiness that spoke volumes. As the days bled into weeks, the intensive search efforts, consuming vast resources and human endurance, began to scale back. The grim reality of prolonged exposure in such extreme conditions weighed heavily on everyone. The initial flurry of activity gave way to a more methodical, less hopeful approach. The canyon held its secrets close, refusing to yield any definitive answers, leaving behind only the chilling void of their sudden, inexplicable disappearance. Weeks bled into months, and the relentless, organized search for Liam and Chloe, along with their unborn child, finally ground to a halt. The official press conferences became shorter, the pronouncements grimmer. Resources, finite and stretched thin, had to be reallocated. The canyon of lost souls, once swarming with rescue teams and buzzing with the distant hum of helicopters, slowly reverted to its ancient silent state. The brightly colored vests of the searchers vanished, replaced by the natural hues of rock and sand. Liam and Chloe were formally declared missing persons, their case relegated to the cold files, a lingering question mark in the annals of unsolved disappearances. For their families, however, the cessation of the active search brought no closure, only an amplification of their anguish. Sarah, Chloe's sister, found herself trapped in a purgatory of grief, unable to mourn, unable to accept. Every phone call from an unknown number sent her heart leaping, only to plummet into despair when it proved to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. The news, once filled with their story, moved on to other tragedies, other headlines. But for Sarah and her parents, the world had stopped on that fateful day. The fact that Chloe had been pregnant added an unbearable layer of suffering, a double loss that haunted their waking hours and invaded their dreams. They imagined a small, innocent life, never given the chance to breathe, swallowed by the same unforgiving wilderness. The public, initially captivated by the tragic tale of the young couple and their unborn baby, eventually lost interest, turning their attention elsewhere, leaving the families to bear their unimaginable burden in lonely silence. The police had exhausted every lead, every theory. Was it an accident? Had they simply wandered off the trail, succumbing to the elements? The canyon had claimed countless lives over the centuries, its beauty often masking its treacherous nature. Or was it something more sinister? Foul play was always a possibility, but there was no evidence, no struggle, no discarded items that pointed to an altercation or abduction. No ransom notes arrived, no suspicious characters were cited. The few footprints found near the trailhead offered no coherent narrative. The absence of concrete answers gnawed at detectives, leaving them with an unsatisfactory conclusion. The desert simply took them. Life, in its brutal indifference, slowly resumed around the gaping void left by Liam and Chloe. Friends found themselves awkwardly avoiding the subject, uncertain how to comfort those who had lost so much without a body to bury, a grave to visit. Their apartment sat empty, their belongings gathering dust, a poignant shrine to lives suddenly interrupted. The canyon of lost souls, now quiet once more, seemed to guard its secrets with a stoic indifference. Its towering red walls, sculpted by eons of wind and water, offered no confessions, no whispers of what transpired that fateful day. It remained a place of stark, untamed beauty, But for those who knew the story of Liam and Chloe, it was forever tinged with an air of profound, unsettling mystery, a silent tomb for a love story, a future, and a fragile, nascent life. The question of what truly happened hung heavy in the air, a phantom limb of grief for all who knew them, refusing to fade into oblivion. 3 years had carved new lines on the face of the Canyon of Lost Souls, but for Matt it remained a steadfast sanctuary. The saga of Liam and Chloe, once a fleeting headline that sparked a national outpouring of concern, had faded into the vast annals of unsolved mysteries. For Matt, however, the canyon was not a place of tragedy or cold cases, but a living, breathing entity, a crucible for his own private rituals. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and religiously on Saturdays, he would park his weathered pickup truck at a less frequented trailhead, exchange his street shoes for worn but sturdy trail runners, and disappear into its ancient embrace. He was a creature of habit, and the desert's predictable rhythms mirrored his own need for order in a world that often felt chaotic. Matt was a man who preferred the company of solitude, finding a profound peace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the earth, the dry whisper of the wind, and the expansive, indifferent silence of the wilderness. A software engineer by trade, his days were spent tethered to screens and the relentless chatter of virtual collaboration. The canyon was his antidote, a primal connection that grounded him, allowing his mind to unspool the knots of urban living. He ran not for speed records, but for the sheer, unadulterated freedom of movement, for the raw sensation of his muscles working in harmony with the natural world. He knew the canyon's contours intimately, the precarious ledges where a misplaced step could lead to disaster, the hidden alcoves that offered pockets of shade from the searing midday sun, the subtle shifts in the rock formations that told tales of millennia. He had witnessed countless sunrises paint the canyon walls in a kaleidoscope of light, and he had felt the profound calm of its evenings when the stars emerged like pinpricks in a vast inky canvas. He carried a minimal pack, a hydration bladder, a small first aid kit, and a single, well-worn protein bar. His only companion was the echo of his own breath and the occasional rustle of unseen desert wildlife. He wasn't one for casual conversation with other hikers. He greeted them with a polite nod, his gaze already drifting back to the trail ahead. His connection to the canyon was personal, almost spiritual. It was a place where he could shed the anxieties of modern life, where the scale of the landscape diminished his own problems into insignificance. The tragic story of the missing couple had briefly cast a somber pall over his beloved trails, but he had compartmentalized it, seeing it as an external event that, while heartbreaking, did not alter the fundamental sanctity of his refuge. He often wondered about them, of course, about the inexplicable force that had simply swallowed them whole, leaving behind only unanswered questions and lingering grief for their loved ones. But such thoughts were fleeting, transient shadows quickly dispersed by the insistent rhythm of his run and the profound peace he found in the desert's embrace. Today, however, as he set out under a sky of impossibly clear azure, something was different. A subtle shift in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that suggested the canyon was about to reveal a secret it had held captive for far too long. The sun, now halfway through its morning climb, beat down on the Canyon of Lost Souls, turning the red earth into a shimmering canvas of heat. Matt, deep into his Saturday run, felt the familiar burn in his legs, a comforting ache that signaled effort and progress. He followed the winding, almost imperceptible trail he had carved out for himself over countless runs, a path known only to him and the occasional desert creature. His mind, usually a whirlwind of code and algorithms, was blissfully clear, focused only on the rhythm of his breathing and the ever-changing panorama of rock and sky. He passed the usual landmarks, a gnarled juniper tree clinging precariously to a cliff face, a cluster of ancient petroglyphs almost indistinguishable from the rock, a narrow sun-drenched wash that sometimes held a trickle of water after a rare rain. Today, however, an anomaly broke his routine. As he rounded a bend in the trail, a sudden flurry of movement caught his eye. A flock of scavenger birds, buzzards mostly, circled lower than usual, their dark forms cutting stark silhouettes against the bright sky. They weren't just soaring, they were dipping and rising, an agitated dance that suggested something specific, something unusual, lay beneath them. Matt, a keen observer of the desert's subtle language, immediately recognized this as a deviation from the norm. His usual route would have taken him further along the main wash, but an instinct, a primal curiosity he often indulged in the wilderness, pulled him off course. He veered left, scrambling up a gentle, rocky incline towards the source of the commotion, his trail shoes finding purchase on the loose scree. The air grew heavy with a faint metallic scent as he drew closer, a scent he couldn't quite place. The buzzards, sensing his approach, lifted reluctantly, their shadows briefly sweeping over the ground before they settled on distant ledges, watching him with an unnerving patience. Matt reached a small, shallow overhang, barely more than a ripple in the sandstone cliff face. It wasn't a cave nor a prominent shelter, just a slight indentation, easily overlooked by anyone not actively searching. The ground beneath it was soft, composed of accumulated fine sand and fragmented rock. It was here, half buried in the sifted dust, that he saw it. It wasn't a bone or a piece of fabric or anything that immediately suggested the grim end of a human life. It was a compact, dark object, partially obscured by a thin layer of sand, its surface dull but intact. He knelt, brushing away the fine grit with a cautious hand, and uncovered an old action camera. Its once bright case was faded by years of sun and wind, a fine coating of desert dust clinging to every crevice. But its lens, surprisingly, was clear. It looked remarkably preserved, as if the elements, usually so destructive, had instead sealed it in a time capsule of sand and shadow. A powerful sense of cognitive dissonance washed over him. How could something so technological, so clearly out of place, have survived so long, forgotten in such a remote, harsh environment? It was a relic, a silent observer from a forgotten time, waiting patiently to be discovered. Matt carefully picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight, the gritty texture of its forgotten past against his palm. He turned it over, examining its faded buttons, a flicker of an almost scientific curiosity overriding the runner's calm he usually sought. This wasn't a casual piece of litter. It felt significant, heavy, with a story untold. He knew instinctively that this small, unassuming device held a secret, a missing piece of a puzzle he wasn't even aware existed, buried in the heart of the canyon he called his own. The silence of the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to uncover what it had so carefully guarded. The return journey from the canyon felt different for Matt. The familiar rhythmic pounding of his feet against the earth was still there, but beneath it thrummed an unusual urgency, a compelling need to uncover the secrets held by the small sand-covered device clutched tightly in his hand. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the landscape as he drove home, but his mind was already racing, anticipating the moment he could finally connect the camera. He felt a peculiar mix of apprehension and exhilaration, like an archaeologist on the cusp of unearthing a significant artifact. Back in the quiet solitude of his apartment, the camera felt heavier, more substantial, imbued with an unspoken narrative. He found a compatible adapter for its memory card and slid it into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a directory filled with video files, each one a fragment of a story. A small wave of trepidation washed over him. He was about to peer into someone else's last moments, to become an unwitting witness to a private tragedy. He selected the first file, and the screen filled with the vibrant, sun-drenched landscape of the Canyon of Lost Souls. The initial frames were idyllic, almost postcard perfect. The camera, clearly mounted on a headstrap or chest harness, bobbed gently, capturing the familiar red rock formations, the vast expanse of azure sky, and the intricate patterns of desert flora. Then, the figures of Liam and Chloe appeared. They were young, their faces initially lit with the carefree glow of adventurers. Liam, appearing energetic and enthusiastic, often turned to the camera, offering a wide, if slightly forced smile. Chloe, walking beside him, sometimes glanced back, her eyes briefly meeting the lens. Matt noted the subtle but undeniable curve of her abdomen, clearly visible beneath her hiking shirt, a poignant detail that instantly connected these digital ghosts to the tragic headlines he vaguely remembered. She moved with a gentle caution, a natural protectiveness of the life she carried, occasionally placing a hand on her stomach. For a while the footage depicted a typical hike, scenic vistas, the crunch of boots on gravel, the occasional close-up of a lizard scurrying across a rock. There were moments of shared laughter, brief snippets of conversation too muffled to discern, but their body language spoke volumes. Liam would occasionally reach for Chloe's hand, a gesture that seemed both instinctive and, at times, met with a subtle resistance. Chloe's smiles, though present, often seemed to fade quickly, replaced by a thoughtful, almost distant expression as her gaze drifted towards the horizon. As Matt continued to watch, the subtle shifts in their dynamic became more pronounced. The camera captured longer periods of silence between them, a silence that felt increasingly heavy, laced with an unspoken tension. Liam's attempts at lightheartedness grew more strained, his gestures of affection more insistent than genuine. Chloe, on the other hand, appeared more withdrawn, her movements slower, her shoulders often hunched, as if carrying a burden heavier than her pregnancy. The pristine beauty of the canyon, once a backdrop for joy, slowly began to mirror the escalating emotional distance between them. The camera, a silent, unblinking eye, was meticulously documenting not just their physical journey through the canyon, but their arduous emotional trek through a relationship on the brink. Each minute of footage deepened the sense of unease, transforming the scenic hike into a slow, inexorable descent into a private drama, making Matt brace himself for what the next frames would inevitably reveal. He knew with a certainty that chilled him that these were not just random vacation videos, but the chilling prelude to something far more profound and tragic. Matt's eyes remained glued to the laptop screen, the flickering images illuminating his rapt face in the darkened room. The scenic beauty of the canyon in the video had receded, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable intimacy. The camera, still fixed to what appeared to be Liam's head, suddenly swiveled, capturing Chloe's face in a tight, unblinking close-up. Her expression was no longer just weary, it was etched with a profound exasperation, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Liam's voice, though distorted by the wind and the camera's limited audio, rose in pitch, his words becoming clearer, sharper. The casual pretense of their hike had completely dissolved, replaced by the ugly reality of their fractured relationship. They had stopped near a precipitous drop-off, the vast emptiness of the canyon floor stretching hundreds of feet below them, an almost cruel metaphor for the void that had opened between them. Chloe's voice, though softer, carried an icy tremor that cut through the desert wind. She gestured wildly, her hand inadvertently brushing against her swollen abdomen, a gesture that seemed to ignite something in Liam. His own carefully constructed facade crumbled. He began to pace, his movements agitated, his words tumbling out in a furious torrent. The argument, once simmering beneath the surface, now exploded into the open. The words that emerged from Liam's mouth were a stunning confession, delivered with a desperate, almost manic energy. He admitted to massive, crippling debts, far beyond anything Chloe could have imagined. These weren't just credit card bills or bad investments. He spoke in hushed, panicked tones of illegal gambling rings, of dangerous connections, of threats that had escalated beyond his control. He described how the pressure had been mounting for months, suffocating him, consuming his every thought. He had tried to conceal it, to shield her from the grim reality, but the weight of it had become unbearable. His desperation was palpable, his fear raw and unvarnished, echoing in the quiet room where Matt watched. He even lashed out, his voice laced with bitterness, hinting that the impending arrival of their child had only intensified the crushing burden forcing him into riskier ventures to secure their perceived future. The pregnancy, which should have been a beacon of hope, had instead become another source of unbearable pressure, pushing him further into the illicit underworld he now inhabited. Chloe, initially stunned into silence, rallied with a furious counterattack. Her own secret, meticulously guarded for years, burst forth in a torrent of pained accusation. She revealed the existence of a substantial inheritance, left to her by a reclusive great-aunt years prior, a sum she had carefully invested and kept hidden from Liam. Her voice trembled as she explained her reasons, painting a vivid picture of his past financial recklessness, his impulsive decisions, his tendency to squander resources. She had feared, rightly so, that if he knew about the money, he would have squandered it on his schemes, leaving them both vulnerable. Her actions, born of a desperate need for security, now stood exposed as a testament to the profound lack of trust that had poisoned their marriage. The knowledge of her secret fortune, held back while he spiraled into debt and danger, ignited a fresh fury in Liam, his face contorting with betrayal. He saw it not as protection, but as a deliberate act of deception, a weapon wielded against him in their dying relationship. The desert wind, which had once seemed to whisper secrets, now howled like a banshee through the camera's microphone, amplifying the raw emotion. The canyon, once a place of serene beauty, had become an echoing chamber for their bitter, final confrontation. Every word exchanged, every gesture, was steeped in years of accumulated resentment and shattered dreams. Matt, a passive observer, felt the cold prickle of unease. This wasn't just a couple arguing, this was an unraveling, a catastrophic collapse of trust and love, played out against the indifferent backdrop of an ancient landscape. The camera, held steady for a moment, offered a chilling, unblinking record of their final, devastating revelations, building an unbearable tension for what had to come next. The air in Matt's apartment felt heavy, charged with the palpable despair emanating from the screen. The raw confessions hung heavy in the desert air, thick with the dust of shattered trust. Liam's face, captured in agonizing detail by the still-mounted camera, was a mask of furious betrayal, his jaw clenched, eyes blazing. Chloe, her own anger now tinged with a desperate fear, recoiled from his accusations, her hand instinctively going to protect her burgeoning belly. The chasm between them felt impossibly wide, a gaping maw of resentment, mirroring the real chasm at their feet. The air crackled with a volatile energy, the tension building to an unbearable crescendo. Liam, driven by a cocktail of panic, rage, and a profound sense of injustice over Chloe's hidden wealth, took a step forward, his voice rising to a hoarse roar. He wasn't aiming to harm her, not consciously, but his gesture was wild, an uncontrolled physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. He extended a hand, not to console, but to punctuate a desperate, venomous question, perhaps to grab her arm in a desperate plea for understanding or a furious demand for explanation. The camera, still fixed to his head, captured the sudden, jarring movement, the violent thrust of his arm through the frame. Chloe, already off balance from the intensity of the confrontation and the added weight of her pregnancy, was caught completely unprepared. Her footing, already precarious on the loose gravel near the cliff edge, betrayed her. The subtle shift in her center of gravity, amplified by her pregnant body, made her recovery impossible. Her eyes widened in a flash of pure terror, a silent scream frozen on her lips as she stumbled backward. Matt, watching the horror unfold on his screen, felt a visceral lurch in his own stomach, as if he too were losing his balance. The camera jolted violently as Liam's body twisted in a desperate, futile attempt to catch her, or perhaps to avoid the inevitable. There was a sickening, choked gasp from Chloe, a sound of sheer, unadulterated fright that pierced the silence of Matt's room. The angle of the camera suddenly pitched downwards, spinning wildly. For a terrifying, disorienting instant, all that filled the frame was a blur of crimson rock and the impossibly vast, empty expanse of the canyon floor rushing upwards. Then, with a jarring thud, the world on screen went dark, or rather, it went still, tilted at an odd static angle. The camera, dislodged from Liam's head by the violent movement, had plummeted. It hadn't fallen all the way into the abyss, a twisted stroke of fate. Instead, it had somehow struck a narrow hidden crevice in the rock face just below the ledge, wedging itself firmly between two ancient stones. It lay there, a silent, unblinking witness, its lens now aimed not at the vast panorama of the canyon, but at a small, isolated patch of red rock and a sliver of the sky above. The audio, though muffled, continued to record. A faint, almost imperceptible sound of sliding rock, then a terrible, prolonged silence. Matt leaned closer to the screen, his breath hitched in his throat. The static image, the unwavering silence, was more terrifying than any scream. The camera had become a tomb's eye, capturing the aftermath of an unthinkable tragedy, and in its cold, unfeeling gaze, Matt knew, lay the irrefutable truth of Chloe and her unborn child's final moments. The true horror, he realized, had just begun. The world on Matt's screen remained unnervingly still, a tilted, grainy image of rock and sky, yet the silence was punctuated by ragged, primal gasps. Liam's voice, now a desperate, guttural sob, echoed through the tiny speakers. He was no longer visible in the frame, but his presence was overwhelmingly palpable, just out of sight of the wedged camera. There was the distinct sound of scrambling footsteps, loose rock cascading down the cliff face. A frantic, almost animalistic cry tore through the air, followed by a series of desperate, guttural calls of, "Chloe! Chloe!" The raw anguish was unmistakable, a sound of utter devastation that sent a chill down Matt's spine. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Matt imagined Liam teetering on the edge of the abyss, peering into the impossible depths, grappling with the unimaginable horror of what had just transpired. The initial shock, the visceral terror of the accidental push, would have given way to a paralyzing grief, swiftly followed by a cold, insidious dread. The weight of his actions, the stark, brutal reality of Chloe's fall, and the horrifying truth of his unborn child's demise must have crushed him. But then, as the sounds from Liam grew more controlled, more deliberate, a terrifying shift occurred. The sobs quieted, replaced by a strained, shallow breathing. The frantic calls stopped. A chilling silence descended once more, broken only by the incessant drone of the desert wind. Suddenly, Liam's figure reappeared on the periphery of the frame, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. He was on the ledge, but his gaze was not downwards into the chasm. Instead, his head darted wildly from side to side, scanning the desolate landscape. His face, when it momentarily flickered into view, was a grotesque mask of raw terror and a dawning, terrible resolve. The panic was still there, but it had curdled into something far more sinister, a desperate, self-preserving instinct. Matt watched, horrified, as the truth slowly dawned on him. Liam wasn't looking for Chloe. He was looking for witnesses. He was calculating, in that desperate, fractured moment, the ramifications of what had just happened. The accidental push, combined with his crippling debts and Chloe's hidden fortune, painted a picture he knew would be damning, impossible to explain away. What followed was a chillingly methodical performance, executed by a man consumed by self-preservation. Liam, apparently unaware of the camera lodged inches away from the fatal edge, began to systematically dismantle any trace of their presence, any evidence that might lead back to him. His hands, though trembling, moved with a horrifying purpose. He located their backpacks, which had been set aside during their argument, and emptied their contents. Matt saw him scatter some items, a water bottle, a used map, a few granola bar wrappers, in a way that mimicked an accidental spill during a fall, but other, more personal items were carefully gathered. Chloe's wallet, her cell phone, his own identification. These disappeared into his pockets, snatched away like forbidden fruit. He even removed his own hiking poles, which had been propped against a rock, ensuring nothing was left behind that could connect him directly to the scene of their disappearance, only to a general tragic accident. He pulled off Chloe's lightweight jacket, which she had shed earlier due to the heat, and strategically placed it near a precarious rock formation, as if it had snagged there during a tumble. He kicked loose a few stones near the cliff edge, creating a small, fresh slide of scree that would suggest a struggle or a misstep. His movements were rapid, almost frenzied, yet terrifyingly precise. He seemed to be painting a picture for future searchers, a narrative of a sudden, unforeseen misstep, a tragic double accident in the unforgiving wilderness. He checked his phone, a brief, frantic glance, confirming no signal, no way to call for help, or perhaps no way to be tracked. The silence from him was profound, a stark contrast to the earlier wails. It was the silence of a man making a terrible, life-altering decision, his every action designed to obscure the truth. He wiped at his face, not just sweat, Matt realized, but something else. Tears, perhaps, or the desperate effort of a man trying to erase the very memory of his own horror. The camera remained fixed, a silent, unblinking eye, meticulously recording his desperate, chilling deception, and Matt watched, transfixed, as Liam began to erase their existence. The canyon, once their intended sanctuary, had become a tomb, and Liam, the sole survivor, was diligently sealing its entrance, unknowingly leaving behind the only witness. Liam stood on the cliff's edge, a spectral figure against the deepening twilight, surveying his handiwork. Every trace of his immediate presence had been meticulously erased, every detail considered in his frantic, self-serving attempt to construct a flawless illusion. He took a long, shuddering breath, the cool evening air doing little to calm the frantic hammering of his heart. The taste of dust and desperation coated his tongue. He had transformed a horrific accident into a meticulously staged disappearance, a macabre theater of deceit played out in the silent, ancient amphitheater of the canyon. He made one last sweeping glance around the immediate area. His eyes, though clouded with shock and exhaustion, missed the subtle glint of the camera, still lodged firmly in the crevice just below the ledge. Its lens, a silent, unblinking eye, continued its chilling vigil, capturing every calculated movement, every furtive glance. Liam bent down once more, scooping up a handful of loose soil and gently sprinkling it over a faint footprint he had almost overlooked, smoothing it with the sole of his boot. He even paused to snap a small dead branch from a nearby bush, tossing it a few feet away to create a more natural pattern of debris. He was crafting a narrative for the unseen investigators, a story of an unfortunate misstep, a tragic double accident in the merciless embrace of the wilderness. The silence around him was profound, broken only by the rustle of his own clothes and the distant, almost mournful cry of a coyote. Convinced that his gruesome tableau was complete, that the canyon would now forever guard his terrible secret, Liam began his descent from the perilous ledge. His movements, once frantic, were now a grim march of determination. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to see, no one left to save. The weight of his actions, the chilling reality of Chloe's fall, and the unacknowledged demise of their unborn child seemed to propel him forward, down the winding, treacherous path. He moved with a speed born of terror and a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of his undoing. The camera, from its hidden perch, continued to record. It captured the slow, steady receding of Liam's figure as he retreated from the scene. His silhouette grew smaller and smaller against the vast, indifferent landscape, eventually merging with the deepening shadows of the canyon. The sun, finally relinquishing its hold on the sky, cast the final moments of the footage in a somber, muted light. Then there was only the vast, empty expanse of the canyon wall, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the rock, and the ceaseless, dry whisper of the wind. The camera, faithful to the last, recorded the slow creep of shadows, the faint hum of unseen insects, and the profound, echoing silence that settled over the scene. Eventually, as the light faded completely, so too did the power source of the device. The tiny red indicator light, which had glowed steadily throughout Liam's horrifying charade, flickered once, twice, and then extinguished itself, plunging the screen into complete and utter darkness. The record of that terrible day, of Liam's desperate deception, was now complete. awaiting the unwitting eye that would finally bring its chilling truth to light. The Canyon of Lost Souls, once a silent guardian, had finally revealed its most terrible secret, patiently waiting for 3 years for the right moment to deliver its damning testimony. The final fade to black on Matt's laptop screen left him in a profound, ringing silence that seemed to consume the entire room. He sat motionless for a long time, the glow of the screen illuminating his stunned face. The casual curiosity that had led him to retrieve the camera had morphed into a chilling witness to a crime, a secret, held captive by the very landscape he cherished. The full weight of what he had seen settled upon him, the accidental push, the desperate fall of a pregnant woman, and the calculated, horrifying deception that followed. It wasn't an unfortunate disappearance, a tragic consequence of the wilderness. It was an act of profound cowardice and manipulation, orchestrated by a man who had chosen self-preservation over any shred of human decency. His mind raced, a whirlwind of images and sounds from the video, the raw anguish in Liam's initial cries, the terrifying shift to cold calculation, the meticulous steps taken to create a false narrative. It was a psychological torment to behold. And at the heart of it all, Chloe, her vulnerability amplified by her pregnancy, falling into the void. The fact that an unborn life had been lost, not to a random accident, but to the desperate actions of its own father, added an unbearable layer of tragedy that solidified Matt's resolve. This wasn't just a cold case, it was a story of a double homicide that had been disguised as a mystery. There was no question of what he had to do. His hand, still slightly trembling, reached for his phone. He called the local sheriff's department, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. He identified himself then, in a measured tone, explained his discovery, carefully omitting the gruesome details of the video itself, knowing that such a claim would sound outlandish without the tangible proof. The dispatcher's voice on the other end conveyed a polite skepticism, the weary tone of someone used to outlandish claims and false alarms. But Matt insisted, his quiet conviction unwavering. "I found an action camera in the Canyon of Lost Souls," he stated, his voice firm, "and it shows exactly what happened to Liam and Chloe." Within the hour, 2 uniformed deputies arrived at his doorstep. Their initial demeanor was cautious, professional, tinged with that same polite skepticism. They took his statement, meticulously noting the details of his run, the location of the camera's discovery, and his seemingly fantastical claim about its contents. Matt, anticipating their doubt, simply handed them the camera and the memory card. "You just need to watch this," he said, his gaze unwavering. The real shift in their demeanor came later that evening as Matt sat in a sterile interrogation room, sipping lukewarm coffee, while the camera's footage was being reviewed by seasoned detectives. The initial skepticism among the investigators would have been palpable, given the years that had passed and the official closure of the case. They would have approached it as a long shot, a formality. But as the first frames played, showing the ill-fated hike, the familiar landscape, a flicker of recognition for the cold case they all knew would have crossed their faces. Then, as the tension between Liam and Chloe escalated, as their voices grew louder, revealing the buried secrets of debt and deception, the detectives would have leaned forward, their expressions hardening. The moment of Chloe's fall, the jarring lurch of the camera, the muffled scream, and then the chilling, deliberate actions of Liam on the cliff edge, wiping prints, scattering false clues, disappearing into the twilight, would have silenced the room. The sheer audacity of his deception, captured in such raw, undeniable clarity, would have been an electrifying shock. The grim reality that a pregnant woman, officially declared missing, had instead met such a brutal, concealed end, would have ignited a furious resolve within the department. The cold case, once relegated to dusty files, exploded back into terrifying life. The news of the reopened investigation, fueled by the leaked details of the video's contents, quickly spread, reigniting the public's dormant interest, transforming the long-forgotten tragedy into a sensational, infuriating revelation, Liam, somewhere out there, blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed alibi had been shattered by a tiny, forgotten eye, was about to face the full, unyielding force of justice. The news broke like a sonic boom across the nation, shattering the silence that had shrouded the disappearance of Liam and Chloe for 3 agonizing years. The press conference, held in a somber, packed room at the sheriff's department, was brief but devastatingly impactful. The chief of police, his face grave, announced the discovery of crucial evidence that had completely unraveled the initial missing persons case, revealing a truth far more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. The details, slowly and methodically leaked to the media over the following days, painted a chilling picture: an argument, an accidental push, and a calculated, cold-hearted deception designed to bury a crime and its perpetrator beneath layers of sand and forgotten time. The revelation that Chloe had been pregnant at the time of her death added a particularly agonizing dimension to the tragedy, sparking a fresh wave of public outrage and sorrow. For Chloe's parents, the truth, when it finally reached them, was a paradox of unbearable pain and a fragile, desperate sense of relief. For 3 years they had lived in a limbo of uncertainty, their grief suspended, unable to truly mourn without a body, without answers. They had clung to the faintest flicker of hope that their daughter and grandchild might somehow still be alive, victims of amnesia or a remote accident. Now that faint hope was brutally extinguished, replaced by a searing, definitive knowledge. The images of the video, though spared from public consumption, were described in hushed tones by the detectives, painting a vivid, horrifying tableau of their daughter's final moments. The accidental nature of her fall offered a sliver of desperate solace. It wasn't premeditated murder, but the subsequent actions of Liam, the man they had once welcomed into their family, were an unforgivable betrayal that turned their grief into a cold, righteous fury. The weight of losing not just their daughter, but their unborn grandchild, a life they had anticipated with such joy, settled upon them with a crushing finality. They could finally weep, truly weep, for what was lost, for lives extinguished before their time. Liam, tracked down using a combination of financial forensics and the re-examined digital footprint of his movements in the days following the incident, was apprehended far from Arizona, living under an assumed name, haunted by his secret but believing himself safe. His arrest, broadcast on national news, brought a grim satisfaction to those who had followed the case. The legal process, slow and methodical, would now unfold, promising a measure of justice for Chloe and their unborn child. The community, once united in a shared sense of loss and mystery, now channeled its collective grief and anger into a demand for accountability. For Matt, the jogger, the accidental catalyst of this devastating truth, the immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of police interviews, media attention he never sought, and the heavy burden of being the bearer of such terrible news. He had simply run a familiar trail, stumbled upon an object, and in doing so had opened a portal to a buried past. He received no accolades, only the quiet gratitude of a shattered family. He had not solved the crime, he had simply revealed it. Yet, in his quiet way, he had brought an unimaginable measure of peace to Chloe's parents. They now had a story, a narrative to contextualize their loss, and a direction for their grief. They could begin the long, arduous process of healing, knowing the truth. The Canyon of Lost Souls for Matt would never be quite the same. It was no longer just a sanctuary for his runs, a place of personal solitude. It was also a monument to human frailty, to secrets held and truths unearthed. Its ancient walls, once silent witnesses to his peace, now seemed to whisper the tragic tale of Liam and Chloe, forever etched into its red rock heart. Yet, in a strange, profound way, its silence had also been its greatest act of revelation, holding the terrible truth patiently until the right moment and the right person came along to discover it. The story of Liam and Chloe, a cautionary tale of secrets, desperation, and betrayal, would linger in the canyon's lore, a somber reminder that even in the vast, indifferent expanse of the wilderness, truth sometimes finds a way to surface.